Hi, I'm Dylan Paris. I'm a musician, a YouTuber, and I work in tech for my day job. And if you've been watching my channel for a bit, you know I like to shuffle around with technology. I like trying new things, buying and selling gear, and just, getting my hands on as many different tools as possible to kind of find the best ones that are a good fit for me. I recently made a video, maybe a couple months ago, about my Gigabyte Aero 15 gaming laptop versus the M1 MacBook Pro. At the time, I didn't have an M1 MacBook Pro. It was more talking about why I had the gaming laptop versus getting an M1 MacBook Pro, knowing what we know, which is that they're really great machines for most workflows except for gaming. Well, I finally made the switch, and I now have an M1 MacBook Pro. This is the 2020 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro with 512 gig SSD and only 8 gigs of RAM. The reason I got the cheaper model, and I got it used, by the way, I saved I think $350 off list price because I got it on eBay. The reason I got that cheaper model is because I actually still have an 11-inch M1 iPad Pro with 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. I haven't made a video about this because I've gone back and forth so much, I stopped wanting to really document it because it got kind of ridiculous. But because I really wasn't able to get a good value back on reselling the 11-inch, I decided to keep that one and sell the 12.9-inch. There's way more of a demand for the 12.9-inch because it has the mini LED screen, and because I didn't get the super high spec model, it was a lot easier to find a buyer for that one than for this. And I really, sunk cost is a fallacy, but at the same time, it didn't make sense to lose $500 right out the gate on a brand new iPad. And so I've actually been using that M1 iPad to edit these videos, to create a lot of content using Beatmaker 3, and I've had a really good time with it. Along with the iPad Pro, I've been using this Maschine Plus, which I purchased with my own money. Not sponsored or anything like that. All of this was my own money. I've been using this as my primary music making device for my next album and for putting together content for my live shows. The reason I still needed the laptop was for mixing and mastering in Ableton and for converting old songs, because basically everything else I've ever done was in Ableton, converting those into stems and loops that I could then put onto the Maschine. And then in reverse for mastering and mixing anything I made on the Maschine or the iPad. The other thing that's worth knowing is that I own basically every gaming system on the market. I have a PS5, an Xbox Series X, and a Nintendo Switch. And so knowing that, I realized I really didn't need a gaming laptop as well, and it was really only getting used for really minor tasks, and given how much I paid for it, it just didn't feel right to keep it. And so I was able to get $1,800 for that laptop, and then only spend $1,150 on this one. And when I got the M1 MacBook Pro, which was only a few days ago, I got it assuming I would just use it for mixing and mastering in Ableton, but I've actually found it to be just such a fantastic device that I actually had a moment yesterday where I was like, should I sell everything else and just use this M1 MacBook Pro, which is a thing that happens to me a lot, as you might know if you watch my channel. And I've decided today, no, I'm going to keep all this gear. This will be like my trio of, music brains, right? I have MIDI keyboards and I have other gear, but these are going to be the hub devices. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that iPad content is kind of my bread and butter on YouTube, and not having an iPad Pro really doesn't make sense for me. Also, because I believe in the iPad Pro, and even though I don't think the M1 16 gig 1 terabyte configuration Pro is being used properly right now, it's the kind of device I can hold on to for a really long time, and if I do that, I'm very likely gonna see way more workflows come out that take advantage of that hardware down the line. It's probably going to be years rather than months or weeks, but I'm already using it in a way that feels like it's pushing some of the limits. Obviously, some of those limits are artificial, like the RAM limitation in iOS 14 or iPadOS 14. But, I can screen record and make a song in Beatmaker and not have it crash. And that's something that would really happen on other iPads. And so I do see some of the power already. And to be honest, I haven't made a video yet on my thoughts on the Maschine Plus because they're primarily very optimistic with a couple of caveats, but also because I, throughout a lot of last year and even early this year, got in a habit of getting a new piece of gear and then being like, it's the coolest thing ever, go buy it, or like, this is why it beats the other one, and not really giving the gear the time it needed to find the fatal flaws that affected my workflow, right? And I'll make a different video about that, but let's just say I've been using the Maschine Plus for months now, and it's the coolest standalone device I've ever used. It absolutely does have some glitches, especially loading songs I've already made is pretty funky, which sucks because I got it primarily for live stuff, assuming that, a standalone piece of gear would be a little bit more stable than trying to run off an iPad or off a gaming laptop. And that is unfortunately proven to be not super true. And so now the Maschine Plus is kind of floating in the same weird gray zone as the iPad and the gaming laptop were, where it has really great pros, but it has some cons too. I got this M1 MacBook Pro and it's really blowing my mind. I was able to install Ableton and the Arturia V collection and Complete 12, I think is the version I have, as well as Serum, Valhalla Reverb, and some other plugins, and it just loads everything pretty well. There's definitely a bit of a chug when it has to run the Rosetta emulation layer, and you're loading in an Ableton file, which is already Rosetta, with a bunch of VSTs that are also Rosetta emulated. At first, it's kind of like, oh no, and then it does it, and then it's just like golden. The thing I need to look out for if I ever want to just use the MacBook Pro for live performance would be, does it do that every time you like load a song? Because that might not be viable, because it seems to not actually start running that layer until it starts playing the section of a song that actually has the VST playing. I haven't proven that's true. This is like really early usage, but if that proves to be the case, that would be kind of a deal breaker for using this as a live performance device. But again, I must stress, I didn't buy this to be that. I'm just finding it to be so much more powerful than I expected, especially at the configurations it's at, which is, basically half the RAM and half the storage of my iPad Pro. There's just something about Mac OS that's so much more, mature and able to, take advantage of an external display, run pro apps. That's very cool. So there's a couple of elephants in the room. The biggest one is that there's going to be a new MacBook Pro refresh coming really soon. Like really soon. Like this could have been one of the worst times in history to buy one if I bought it new, right? But this thing lists for $1,500 and I bought it for $1,150. So I got a great deal on it. I don't think they're going to get too much cheaper after the new ones come out. And I have a 30-day return window. And so if the new ones are announced within 30 days and they look so much better somehow that I need the 14, which seems unlikely, but could happen, I'll just return this and then get a 14-inch and call it a day. But if I do that, I'm not going to have, the discount I have on this one. If I sell this one now, later, I'm not going to take as much of a hit. It's kind of like buying a used car versus buying a new car, right? You pay a lot to drive off the lot. And someone else already did that with this. If I buy a brand new 14-inch MacBook Pro, I'm paying the new lot fee. And I've done that a lot this year. Not to say lot so much. But I have, I bought the Maschine Plus outright. I bought the 1 terabyte M1 iPad Pro outright, brand new. And they're great devices, but I do regret not waiting, seeing more information about reviews, and then waiting for potential price drops. If you're watching in the UK, you might be wondering why I paid $1,400 USD for the Maschine. That's because the Maschine Plus discounts that happened, to my knowledge, only occurred outside of the US. The USD value of the Maschine Plus has stayed at $1,400, at least new. I checked the other day and I did see there are a couple like 1,000, 1,100 USD used ones now on Reverb, but that was not the case when I bought mine. Otherwise, I would have bought those. So yeah, I currently have 3 pieces of music gear, and that's kind of weird for me. I really do like the idea of finding the one device to rule them all, but I also know myself. If I were to sell the Maschine and sell the iPad, I would just end up buying another iPad down the line, and I would just end up buying an MPC Live 2 or a Maschine Plus again, or a Maschine Mark 3, some kind of standalone, or at least semi-standalone device again, if I sold this. And so in some ways, not selling these is also like a measure to stop myself from buying something else. That said, the M1 MacBook Pro is really cool and really powerful, and I know a million people have already made way more in-depth videos about it, so I highly recommend watching those. But yeah, man, I'm really stoked about the current music technology layout I have now. I really want to see how I can combine them, right? Like maybe use something like AUM on the iPad and run Maschine software on the MacBook, and then use Maschine as the main hub hardware trigger, but have the ability to trigger iPad sounds and funnel them into some kind of interface at the same time. There's a lot of opportunity there. Maybe needlessly complicated, but could be cool. I don't know if that's something people would be interested in, but pretty neat. A couple of my favorite features before I wrap this up. One of the unsung features in the MacBook with the M1 is the ability to play iPad games. And so like all the Grand Theft Autos that they put out on iPad work on the M1 MacBook, and they run pretty well. I was playing San Andreas for a while, and it runs the same way it does on the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. So the graphics are really crispy, the resolution's really nice. Frame rate I think is a locked 30, but it's really a fun experience with the DualShock. I did a little bit of PS5 remote play on the M1, and I think you can do the same thing on the iPad as well. I do really like the form factor of this device because it's bottom heavy rather than top heavy. But I do like the balance of this device. It makes it much easier to have it in your lap and just watch something or play something. The other thing that you probably maybe noticed is instant on, which is just unheard of for a computer. Now, this is iPad bread and butter, but it's new on a Mac, and just immediately being able to go back to where I was, close it, open it, and be where I was just instantaneously. I've not ever had that experience with a laptop. And it is a bunch of little things that add up that you're like, oh wow, this really is a generational leap. And kudos to Apple for how they handled this hardware transition. I mean, honestly, my biggest knock against Apple right now is just that this thing is weaker on paper than this thing. And yet the usage of this thing, because of the software limitations and some of the hardware limitations and how it can be used, essentially using this 1150 8 gig M1 iPad or MacBook Pro feels smoother and more powerful than this $1,500 1 terabyte 16 gig iPad Pro, even though they have the same processor. Obviously this has a fan and a little bit more cooling, but that's not really what the problem is. The problem is that the software doesn't even exist on this to take advantage of the hardware, which puts this at a huge advantage. And so if you can only get one, I would actually recommend getting a used M1 MacBook Pro or waiting for the new announcements this year, and then getting one of the new ones, and then getting a last gen iPad. Currently, I don't see a reason to get an M1 iPad Pro. Unless you run a YouTube channel where you compose music on an iPad and screen record at the same time. In that case, I would recommend at least going for a 2020 iPad Pro, just because RAM actually does become a factor there, and I've noticed an improvement in having more RAM. Outside of that, I really don't feel like anyone needs the M1 iPad Pro right now. Whereas the M1 MacBook Pro is such a phenomenal generational leap, especially if you were messing with Intel 13-inch MacBooks. Those things were kind of hit or miss. I don't want to just talk trash, but they had some issues that just are not present on the M1. So anyway, it's nice to talk to you again. I don't do this as much because I have roommates now, and getting the time to talk and not have a bunch of noise is hard. But great to tell you where I'm at with tech. And, I know some people think this journey is ridiculous, and I get it. But it brings me joy. I budget in other areas. I cook most of my meals. Don't worry about my budget. I'm okay. I have a full-time job. Anyway, keep an eye out on new music. I'm working on my album 2, at least under my name, Dylan Paris. I've made albums before, but this will be my second album as Dylan Paris. The first one is There's Something Better. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, Bandcamp, all those services. Be stoked if you check that out. If you enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing if you're new. And if you already are subscribed, thank you so much. We passed 3,000 recently. This time a year ago, I wasn't even at 1,000. And so seeing the growth of the channel has been really cool, and it really wouldn't happen without you. Anyway, I'll catch you soon.